Hey guys, welcome to this tutorial about how to create a procedural stream in Houdini. We're going to start off with some geometry and later on dive into the UVs, and eventually we'll be creating some flow maps using the game dev toolset. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive into Houdini and let's get going. I'm going to start off with creating a geometry node as we always do, and inside of the geometry node I'm deleting the file node and start off with creating a basic grid. This grid is a little bit small. Set this 200. Let's give it a little bit more density. So we got 400 by 400. Alright, so we got our grid. Up next, we need to, of course, draw out our river. Start off with a curve. And in my viewport, I'm going to hit enter and I'm just going to draw a random line. And I'm going to make sure that it's outside my basic grid, just for now. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to resample this, and I'm going to make sure that instead of straight edges I have my subdivision curves on. What this will do is it will smoothen out the general flow, but without changing the length I'm going to get a lot of points, that many. So just for this tutorial I'm going to set this to 10 so we got a nice idea of what's going on. But it's flowing a little bit too smooth for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a point jitter. And with the point jitter, basically what it does is if I scale this one up, see, it jitters every point into all the three axes. But I don't want all three of them. I need X and Z values. And what this will do is we'll create a nice uneven jittered flow to our river. And then if I create another resample and I set this to example 1, right, so set it to 1 and again set it to subdivision curves. What you can see is we get this nice round flow, but it still has some offset, some of the points, at least in the X and Z values. So the Y, it's nice and neatly put on the grid. Right, so that's the first part of our river, but of course we also need to put in body of our river. I'm going to create a line, and if I look at this line in general, the moment I create it, as you can see, it's just a standing line following the y-axis, but I want it laying down on the floor. So I'm going to set the direction here. I'm going to use the length, see, as my origin. I'm going to use this times negative value of 0.5. And what this does is basically takes half of the total length and it moves the line across the X value or the X axis and places it neatly in the center. Set this to 3 and give it 3 points so I have a nice point exactly in the middle. I'm going to use a sweep. And as my output, I'm setting it to skin unclosed. I'm going to use my line as my initial cross section and my curve as my backbone. What we get is we get our river looking, or starting to look like actual flowing geometry. And that's exactly what we want. So now we have our basic sweep line here. Let's focus a little bit on the grid. I'm going to start off with UV project because I want my UVs to be correct. And I'm just going to turn off the points. Zoom in. I place a UV quick shade. You can see how the UVs get placed along here really big. So what I could do in the UV project is sort of change the U and the V range. So smaller. You can already see that it's starting to come together, and now we actually have a really small grid here. That's what I want. Later on I'll be working closely together with my river, and in that river I'm going to be looking closer at the terrain, so it's easier for me to have it at the same size relatively. I can always change this later if I need. Right. Then let's create a mountain node. The mountain deformer is really nice in Houdini. What it does is it gives a noise on your terrain and it really creates this nice flow of height. I actually want it to be a little bit higher. See, because of the size, the element size of my noise, it's really all squished together. So if I make this element size bigger, see that we get a more mountainous flow. Let's make it really big for now. Really nice curvature that still has the height difference of 10, so we actually get quite some height difference without making it look too weird. Turn on smooth shade it. It's a nice flow for our terrain where we can create our river in. Smooth wire shade it so we can actually see what we're doing. Right, let's go back to our initial curve and let's subdivide what we're doing here. And let's subdivide it. See here, set it to 2. So we get a nice full density on our curve. And then let's create a transform. And let's transform this the Y axis, and let's transform it down for say something like 5, and then use a poly extrude. And I'm just, for the sake of it, I'm going to copy this parameter and I'm going to place that in relative distance. So what we got here is -5, but I want minus, so I'm going to do negative value for this one, and that actually gives me positive value. So if I extrude this, we now have a nice value going up, be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do that times 2. That allows me to really crank up the value. So if I now look at the terrain, what it's doing is it's neatly cutting all the way through. So the initial noise of the terrain was going up 5 and going down 5, so we have a total value of 10. I'm moving my river and cutting right through. So that's exactly what we want, because now we can use a simple Boolean operator. So type in Boolean, and I'm going to put my terrain in one, this one in the other. And basically what this Boolean operator does is it cuts through the terrain, and we get a really nice cutout of the terrain. I'm going to set this to surface so we don't get any errors here. So that is for the river geometry, but I just don't solely want the river, I also want a second one. And here I'm going to use subtract, and that gives me the terrain without a river. And that's exactly what we need, because we'll later use some extra geometry to create a nice riverbed. But we don't need to change the terrain too much. So we now have a nice, let's see, turn on the points. We have a nice curve going on here, neat amount of points. And here we have our exact cutout shape. And that's exactly what we want. So let's continue with the original curve that we had, or at least with cutout shape from the river. And we're going to start with a subdivide, because I want a little bit more geometry. It's to be a little bit denser, so I can start moving around some of the geometry. We turn off the points. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a group. No, not a grid. Group node. Group node, and the cool thing with group nodes is that they have a lot of different functions, right? So now it's just selecting all of the primitives. I actually want to select points, but not those points. The points that I want to have are edge points. And I only want to select unshared edges. It's a really cool function because it allows you to click by one click, create a group. I'm just gonna create a group called edges. And those edges I am going to give a color. So let's place down 2 color nodes. First one, let's give a white color to basically everything, and then another color node, and that's going to be black. Basically I can have 0 values for all. And what happens is you see that the whole thing becomes black, but switch this to edges, creates all those edge points that we had before. After the subdivision, get color black, and I'm going to use a attribute blur. Let's, instead of the point, let's change this to color, and let's have this from a uniform to a edge length. Now let's see if we crank that up, you can see what's happening in there. So if I'm going to play around a little bit, I'm setting these basic values. That gets a nice result for me. I'm going to set this one to proximity. I'm going to change this one to 0.3. Move this around. Have that at a very high level. See it move. So what we have is we have basically our edges that are black. And what we want is we want the middle part, the white parts, we actually want to move them downwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create attribute VOP. And in this VOP, I'm going to use the point position and I'm going to move it down based on the actual attributes. So I'm going to start off with a vector to float. Create two of those. Float one, it's based on our position, and then the second one is based on, as you could guess, the color. Put in the color there. And then what I want to do is I want to eventually float to the vector, and I want to make sure that my position is input. Well, the only value that I want to use is the y value, so the x and z value can stay the same. What I want to do is I want to use this color value, and I want to negate that value from this one, and I want to add that basically to this value. So I'm going to have this as my first input, this is my second input, and then this sum of those two values gets in there. Then if we go out, check here, you can see that it already moves inwards, right? Well, that's actually based on your attribute. So if you're changing up these values, that's where you can change the shape of your river with very steep edges or less steep edges. Or example, just set this to 15, set this to 0.3. And that is basically it for this initial geometry. So let's move on. And in our terrain, we're actually going to do basically the same thing as we did before. So we're going to have a group based on our edges, and we're going to have two colors, and then again with a attribute blur. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these nodes. Of course, I'm not going to call this edges, but in this case, for now, I don't know, I'm just going to call it erosion or so. Oh, not erosion. Erosion. And for the colors, this basically works the same, although of course for this one I change this one as well from X to, it's giving me the group, coloring this one, if you want okay, now showing up. And then with the attribute blur, I'm going to change these values up a little bit. Set this one to 10. And I have a 10 value for the proximity and a 20 value. Decrease the step size a little bit. Right, so now we get a nice black line on the outside river bed. And let's create normals, because we didn't have those yet. Let's create them for both. So we have the normals there on our riverbed, normals on our terrain. And that actually allows me to do the following, which is transferring the normal value. I'm going to give the point normals and show them. So what's happening now is that at the edges here, quickly change the viewport settings. So what's happening is that here you can see it really well, that some of the points are nicely moving upwards. Some of the points are already bending in to the right. And if I look at the other ones, here they're all, because they're on the terrain, nicely pointing upwards. And basically what I want to do is I want to bleed from one into the other one. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a attribute transfer. Let's see, it's the fourth one. I'm gonna hook one and the other one in there. And what I want to do is I want to transfer from points to points, and I want to change the conditions. I'm going to set the distance threshold to 0. I'm going to set my blend width to 0.3, which is a very small amount. But basically what it does is only blending between those edges. And for the attributes, we of course want to blend on the normal, so we don't need the primitive, but we need point normals. So I'm going to turn those ones on. And I am curious if I made a mistake somewhere right now. So it doesn't seem to be changing that much. What's the error I'm getting? Let's check it out. Interesting. So I created normals on this one, created normals on this one, created on the points. Let's see if that works. No, it's still giving me some problem. Ah, okay, so I'm actually changing the wrong stuff. See, it's on group type. It should be add normals to points. There we go. Now we got point normals. So as you see that when I changed the last one, right, this part here changed as well. And now we have our normals perfectly lining up with the normals from our initial river. I'm just gonna hit a smooth node under there, and of course I'm not gonna change the position, but I'm changing normals. And let's have the strength set to view what we're doing. Let's see what the strength is doing. So you can see the stronger I make this smooth, more it blends between the first value and the second value. I don't want 0 because I don't want these points all to stand up, so let's put it to say 5, so we get a nice blend in between from these hard lines to this curving around. So that's it for the smooth. Then let's create some UVs. So let's have our unwrap UV. I'm just gonna play a little bit with these settings. So let's turn this one off. And basically what I want is I want the same size UVs. So I'm using a strip as a layout. I'm gonna place a UV quick shade again, so you can see what I'm doing. So this doesn't look like much, right? Let's start off with, instead of having it from square to a strip, and we don't want it to scale, so scaling. As you can see, there's already quite a decent UV projection going on, but for some reason, as you can see really closely here, is that we have a weird spacing problem going on. And although it looks okay here in Unreal, this is really going to mess up with your textures. So we don't want any spacing. This gets rid of the blurriness and we get really sharp lines. Let's change this to 5 planes because the least amount of planes is nice. With 4 planes, the stretching here becomes a little bit too, so we turn this to 5. Now we get in the middle of our river, we get like where the UV seams are a little bit messed. And the cool thing about working this as a strip means that we don't have to worry about what the direction or what the height or width is of our river, because it will just adapt to the single strip. And that's really neat. So now we have our riverbed completely working with UVs. Let's quickly gonna delete this. Let's make it into a group. So we're gonna hit group again, and this time I do actually want all the groups. Select this as a group, and I'm just going to call this river bed now. And we actually also want to have the terrain as a group, and work on that later on as well, especially for giving stuff materials. This is a convenient way. All right, now all we have to do is merge those two together. So hit a merge, and let's see how that looks. We have 1 and 2 merged together. We have a nice strip going into our terrain. None of the normals messing up. Again, if we hit it to smooth shade it, we shouldn't be able to see a distinction between either of those themes. And for now, it looks like it's actually doing exactly what we want. Nice cutting out of our terrain. And since it's all procedural, we can go all the way back, and I could hit enter on my curve, and I could grab any point, drag this around. Let's wait a little bit for the to update on the attributes, because it's running over all the different procedures in a row. And as you can see here, we're waiting for the operations to cook. I think, oh, let's zoom out a little bit. It's only on our curve. Let's hit enter, you can see the points. Move this out a little bit. Now I'm gonna go all the way down, and then I'm gonna view again what I'm doing. And as you can see, the Boolean operator is quite heavy. So in general, you don't really want to do this too often, but it's just to show the proceduralism in the work. You know, it's still a procedural workflow, because you can change anything from the beginning on, which is really nice. Okay, and then let's start to focus on the actual river, basically the water that will be flowing through the terrain. And the way we will do that is if we go back. So I'm gonna a little all the way back to the terrain. I'm gonna start with my grid, and I'm just gonna hit the transform node, move this down a little bit, poly extrude slightly bigger, and then from there I'm gonna create a group node. Because what I actually want to do, what I want to do is I want to have the input from the terrain that I just created, which is slightly bigger. So smooth wire shape, so you can see that I actually have a little bit of thickness to the terrain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the points that are inside of the original box that we just created. Now you can see that all the points inside are selected, points outside don't get selected. And instead of calling this group 5, I'm going to call this line points for your convenience. From there, I'm going to create a blast node, and I'm going to select the line points, and I'm going to delete non-selected, which means that all I have left is the original curve. Top view, show all. Now you can see that the points inside of the geometry get selected, and then here we are left with all the points that are on the actual curve, that are on the terrain. And that's exactly what we want, because we actually want to have this one right on the river bed that we just created, and we use the cutout shape from the Boolean that we created before. So in here, I'm just quickly placing a small line of text that moves my line up, you could see. And then here with the Boolean, you see that it's hovering over the terrain. Just want it slightly above there, so know that it's actually on the terrain, and not in some cases, and that's why you have to be careful with this, under the terrain. So check that it's above. Right, then after that I'm going to use a ray node, and instead of project rays, I'm going to go for the minimum distance, and on this one I'm going to place an object merge. I don't want all my lines to be tangled up, but I want to use this Boolean for it. So in there, we ray it onto the terrain. That's why we wanted to have a high density before as well on the terrain, to make sure that this was all staying in place correctly. Right. From there, I'm going to transform down a little bit. Say 0. I don't know, let's say 3 for this instance. And I'm going to call this the water height. And the reason why I'm calling this differently is because this is actually one of the channels that I want to be able to access later on. There I'm going to resample this, so negative value, resample this, sample this to a distance of say 1, and subdivision curve, so I get a nice flowing river. As you can see, it's just below the original line right there, which is exactly what I want. My second node that I'm going to create here is a resample node again. but I actually don't need minimum or maximum segments. What I do need is the curve U attribute. I want to create UVs later on, and that's usually easy to use if I already work that in right now. So we already have our U value. From there, I'm gonna place a smooth, because I want to smoothen this out a little bit more. So I'm smoothing out the position. Maybe 10 is too much, so let's scale that down to say 5. And then let's go create the actual geometry. Create a line, and I'm gonna base the length of this line on the original length. Just gonna copy parameter all the way down, length based relative reference. So that one set, 2 points is fine for now. The direction, I again want to have it laying down, so 1 in the x, 0 in that value. And here again the same trick as we did before. But before I'm going to use the sweep, I can already use the sweep. But before I use it, I actually want to have another resample node here. And again, I don't need maximum segments. I want to have the V attribute. So instead of curve U, I'm going to create curve V. And I'm going to use the maximum segments, and I'm going to do that so I can create a nice flow maps later on. So that's my cross section. Before I'm going to plug this one in, I want to create a measure node which gives me a perimeter, and I'm going to create a attribute promote, and I'm going to hit that in there, and I'm actually going to create this from primitive per meter in there, and I'm going to change that to a point. Right, so that gives me our initial UV'd line. Don't forget to change the output here. Skin unclosed. Make sure you don't make any typos like I did. Right, so that gives us the initial sweep, and that means we can move on. And moving on here, that I need to start working on the rest of my UVs, and to have them correctly, I'm going to create a point swap. And inside of the point swap, I'm going to start creating some things. So first, I'm gonna hit a bind. I am actually going to use the curve U that we had before, and I'm going to create a second bind, recopied it, and I'm going to multiply that with the previous created perimeter. Right, so we need a multiply by those two together, and that gives us our curve U. I'm going to hit another bind, and I'm going to use the curve V, and I'm going to create a float to vector, and I'm going to have my multiplied U value for the UVs, one, the other one from the E in there. And I'm going to bind those and hit a bind, and I'm going to have this one named UV. And important is that you override this one, use this node to set the parameter attributes. And finally, export, you have to actually put this to when input is connected, so I can actually put something in. And now we have our UVs correctly based on the measurement node and our original U and V values. Right, so that is that. And then from there, I'm going to promote my attributes. So I'm going to create a attribute promote, and I'm going to promote my UVs from points to vertex. And then after that, I'm going to place a subdivide node. And the reason why I'm placing this subdivide node is because I want to have more geometry, even more, for my flow maps. In our initial geometry here, now we have our subdivided geometry, and just one will do the trick. And from there, as I said, we're going to work on the flow maps. So I'm going to hit flow map, and we have some nice ones. Game dev toolset is really convenient, so big round of applause for Houdini and for Side Effects for creating all those. So we're going to use this one, game dev flow map. Just going to place it down here, and what I can do with this one is I can visualize my flow. As you can see, there's not really much of a flow going on. Right, it looks really cool. Looks a little bit like the Northern Lights if you have some imagination, but it's not the direction that we want, right? We actually want the direction of our original river. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a flow map guide. First, I'm gonna have my guide, and in my guide, I actually need something to work from. So from my previous smooth, I'm just gonna move these ones little bit to the side, and this one I'm gonna hit in there. So now we actually have direction because we had the original line, right? So you can see that in the middle of the water there's a flow going in the direction, and from the sides the velocity or the flow of the river is less. Well, instead of just having visualizer, we could also visualize it by color. So again, with the flow map, there's a lot of different ones, and we have flow map to color. So if I'm going to go here, visualize flow off, you can see that in the middle it's more green, and on the sides it becomes more yellow, or the other way around depending on the setup. We actually are going to create some interesting geometry right now, or interesting geometry, but we're going to make this a little bit more optimized in terms of UVs. So we're going to cut him up. And the way we are going to do that is again using attributes. So let's start with creating our attribute rename of the UVs. So we're going to change our initial UVs that we just created, and we're going to call them UV2. This allows us to access multiple UV sets later on, which is really convenient. Then in the next node, which is a primitive pop, I am going to create another bind. What I want is in this bind is I want to divide the primitive number, so the amount of primitives going on there, by my own input. So what I want is my primitive number, which is here, and I want to hit divide. I'm going to promote this parameter, and then in this one again, and instead of parm, I'm going to call it class. So later on I can actually cut up the geometry based on specific class. In my input number 2 here, I'm going to go back up, and I'm going to this one parameter, this number, and I'm going to multiply that by a certain amount of segments, how big I want each part to be. Now I'm just going to hit 32, and then from there I'm going to have an attribute promote. I am going to promote my class, and I'm going to promote that from, let's see, class. I'm going to promote that from primitive. So now I can use vertex split, which is a very convenient node that splits based on attributes. I'm just create it. Now we actually have different pieces here that cut up. You can already see it a little bit. So if I go here, zoom in a little bit, see too well from the position. What happens is now you can see that it's just one big line here. When I use the vertex split, it cuts it up on that line. And when I'm using in this primitive op, when I'm using the previous number of the resample node, it gives me a value of all the primitives going on. All right, so then I'm gonna create a UV unwrap. I'm just gonna create that here. UV unwrap. Again, it's set to UVs, and I don't want it to scale. And then using the UV layout, I can actually lay the UVs out really neatly inside of my specific UV space. And in this UV layout, you can change some of the settings. You could adjust the padding, so that the space in between all of the different parts has a little bit more. And as you can see, it still puts it on this line, so you could add depending the boundaries, so it doesn't get, you know, like shoved in to the edges of your UV space. It's all really convenient. And then all that's left for us is to actually promote the color that we just had. So let's create a attribute promote. Let's promote the color from the points to the vertex, and that allows us to create all the information that we need in here on the flow maps. All that's left here is to create a output node. I usually use a null node. What I've learned to do is always get my own shapes and my own colors. And in this example for Dokai, we actually work with these colors, so it makes sense on what we're doing. And I'm just gonna call this flow map bake, so I know this is my output. All right. Now we can actually combine all of them together. So all that's left for me to do here is delete visualizers that I had before. So in this flow map, visualize my flow, convenient. This part in here, and basically just delete them. It's all back together again. Should give it normals, know what's going on. And then finally, I'll create another output node. That's how I usually work. So another null node. Again, change the shape and color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this out water surface. Group this one as well. Do that for the output node. So I can name this one. Instead of naming it group 6, I name this water. All right. Well, that's basically it for now. So if I combine all three of these, I should get a very decent looking river. It's a nice first setup. I'm just going to quickly create a color node here. Then we have everything as it's supposed to be. Nice river, decent normals everywhere, looking very neat. Alright, well that's it for this tutorial. On the next tutorial I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into the materials in both Houdini and in Unreal. So we're going to start off creating some stuff in Houdini, and then later on we're going to export everything as a Houdini digital asset or HDA into Unreal. Thanks for watching. This was Dokai. Bye bye.